Hey, what do you think about this, Mike? I said on Sunday that in my experience, this is absolutely true, that the harvest is plentiful and laborers are few. And these reports that people are not interested in the gospel, they're not open to the gospel, I think they are premature and not my experience. I think it's true of some people. Certainly that's true of some people. It was true in Jesus' day. But there is so much more opportunity that we don't even have the resources to respond to. What do you think?
Hey, welcome to Whitefields Community Church Sermon Extra. Great to have you with us once again this week. I'm here with Pastor Nick Cady, pastor of Whitefields Community Church here in Longmont, Colorado. And if you missed us on Sunday, we're we have been in our series in the study of the Gospel of Matthew called Behold Your King. And this week we're wrapping up a section that we've been in, chapters 8 and 9, and we've been looking at 10 miracles that Jesus performed during that time as a way of establishing his authority and establishing his kingdom, and letting people know that he was indeed the Messiah. And so we find ourselves in the last few verses, Matthew 9:27 through 38, seeing people as Jesus did. And so if you missed any of that on Sunday, you weren't able to catch us live, then you can go to our website, whitefieldschurch.com, and you can download it there, or you can go to any of your favorite streaming platforms. You're on YouTube right now watching us, give us a thumbs up, rate and review if you're on a podcast, and just any way you interact with this material. Content is the word I want to use. Content. It is, it certainly helps to raise us up in the search engines. And when people are asking questions about, who Jesus was, how should I see the world, then you are able to, people are able to find answers to their questions. We can give them Christ-centered and gospel-centered answers to those questions. So this week, we want to kind of start off with, before we dive into Matthew per se, actually, it comes from Matthew, is that we wanted to take, how did we get our name, Whitefields Church? Because basically here in Matthew chapter 9, we kind of have a clue to that. We always joke around that this church thing doesn't work out. We always can become a granary or a milling company. But Whitefields, it's a very important phrase, and it actually comes from Scripture. So why don't you give us the history of that?
Yeah, so I didn't name the church. It was named prior to me becoming the pastor here, but I like the name, and I think it's a good name. So the idea is it comes from the idea of the harvest, like when you have certain grains, when they're ready to be harvested, the top of them become white. And I think that in a way speaks to the region that we live in. There's a lot of agriculture here in northern Colorado, and so you see sometimes some of that grain around the fall when it's time to be harvested. But it comes actually from John chapter 4. I think it's verse 36, but I'll tell you a funny story about that is that for years, when I first came, we had these bulletins and they said John 4:32. And if you actually look up John 4:32, it doesn't say, it's the wrong verse. They meant to, I think it's John 4:36. I'll look it up here for you. So it says, John 4:36, already the one who reaps is receiving. It says, lift up your eyes. 35. Lift up your eyes and see the fields are white for the harvest. But it was a different verse, which was nothing to do with that. It's verse 33 or something. Has anyone brought me something to eat?
Yeah.
And so, so we fixed the bulletin eventually, and now bulletins are kind of not a thing as much as
they
they
became
used to be.
obsolete during the pandemic.
Yeah, so it comes from that verse directly, but that's kind of John's, quotation of Jesus saying a very similar idea that he says in Matthew's gospel and in Gospel of Luke as well, where he says, the harvest is plentiful. Pray to the Lord of the harvest to bring laborers into his harvest field. And then the ironic thing, of course, is that those who he tells to pray end up being those who are sent by him in chapter 10, which we'll get into next week. But that's where the idea came from. And I think that maybe there's a nod to George Whitefield in there as well, because George Whitefield was a very prominent evangelist in the Great Awakening period, in the early, it's actually colonial period of the United States prior to the War of Independence. And so, George Whitefield, he was from England, but he came over, he worked with the Wesley brothers, Charles and John Wesley, and they were doing evangelism in colonial America, and got to go to some of those places myself. Actually, I guess it was about a year and a half ago. I was up in Massachusetts, in Springfield, Massachusetts, where they had some memorials to those guys where they were doing ministry there. But yeah, Whitefield was known as an evangelist, he had been trained as an actor. And so he became very famous for his like very expressive and like emotive preaching that he would do, open air preaching that he would do to bring the church to the people, was the idea, because they said that there were certain groups of people who wouldn't go to church. And Wesley and Whitefield, they were like, well, then if they won't go to the church, then we'll bring the church to them. So they would do this open air preaching. They would preach the gospel, and they'd have this emotive, like passionate pleas to, understand the gospel and to respond. And so that's who Whitefield was. And so there's a kind of a probably homage to him as well in there. So
yeah, that's a great history. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how many people have asked me, why you call your church Whitefields? What does Whitefields mean? And well, there you have it. It's John 4:35. The fields are white with harvest. And here Jesus says, then he says to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful in verse 37 of chapter 9. But the laborers are few, therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. And, and that's obviously, that's part of our DNA as a church. We are a church that is involved all over the world and locally. So we're, both and it's just something we're sending out a team. We just had a pancake breakfast on Sunday, raising funds for our team to go out. We're going to Hungary.
And we're doing Mexico. Vacation Bible School. That's a big outreach for us to our community. We get to serve families and serve kids, and a lot of the people who attend, they don't go to our church, but we hope they do. We hope they will. We hope that they'll become believers in Jesus. But we're happy to minister to them for a week, and doing other local outreaches. We got, of course,
Table of Hope.
Pantry is a big deal.
The Table of Hope is killing it. They're really doing a great job.
Yeah, and then like you said, we got a mission trip going to Hungary, Mexico, all kinds of stuff. So try to be really about that mission. Hey, what do you think about this, Mike? I said on Sunday that in my experience, this is absolutely true, that the harvest is plentiful and laborers are few. And these reports that people are not interested in the gospel, they're not open to the gospel, I think they are premature and not my experience. I think it's true of some people. Certainly that's true of some people. It was true in Jesus' day. But there is so much more opportunity that we don't even have the resources to respond to. What do you think?
Oh, I think you're absolutely correct. And I mean, I always laugh because I think every hairstylist I've met at the Great Clips, when they find, why are you here on a Monday or something? I get my hair cut. I'm like, well, I'm a pastor in a church. And like, not one person has said, oh, I hate church. Oh, I hate God. They always say, oh, I've been meaning to go back to church. I mean, that's like every single one. That's probably 5 or 6 that I've run into at the place I go to when they find out who I am.
The haircutting places is a mission field that I have not been active in over the last several years.
Yeah. No, I'm active every 3 months. It's white. There's a lot of cutting that goes on there. But totally. And of course, in Europe, people have said Europe is dead. And that is hogwash, as the word that you used on Sunday, especially in Ukraine right now, and Hungary, and it's never been my experience. People want to talk about God. People are looking for, what is out there. I think a lot of people have come, especially in Europe, Eastern Europe. They went through the whole Americans arrived, in the 90s, and anything he said, I mean, churches were full. We had a great awakening, a great revival time there in Hungary and the surrounding Serbia and in Ukraine. And then kind of the Western, commercialism, the consumerism came in. Everybody, you kind of wanted a new car. They wanted a new house. They wanted the new everything. And then we've kind of come around now where they've realized that there's just nothing in that. And people are asking questions again about what am I here for in this life? And I think if we're able to provide them with Christ-centered, gospel-centered, answers to those questions, and people want to hear those answers. So yeah, completely. I totally agree. It's more a lack of people and resources than it is a lack of people that want to hear the truth, because they truly want to hear the gospel truth.
Yeah. And I mean, I think locally as well, I mean, it's always a matter of like, okay, what do we have the resources to be able to do? Because we always have many opportunities. And so, yeah, so I mean, I would just say to anybody, pray that God will send laborers in the harvest field, and be prepared, because when you pray that prayer, he sends you.
Yeah, and just think about questions you might ask a neighbor. Some ways to open doors and things like that. Sometimes we want to kind of stay at peace with our neighbors and not tell them, we go to church and this and that. We don't want to invite controversy into our lives, but think of ways, opportunities that God can open doors for you to invite them to church, or some way that you can speak and you can help them and go over and put their garbage back, or whatever those kind of things that come to mind. Because I think you are the resource and you have the message.
Yeah, we're always trying to think of, like, a church, like, how can we create things that people will want to invite their neighbors to, like, in addition to Sunday morning? Because I think, man, if you can invite them to Sunday morning, that's great. But sometimes they might just be more open to, like, hey, we're doing a movie thing, or hey, we're doing a youth thing, or whatever it is. And you say, hey, you want to come along with us? And sometimes those are easy on-ramps. But I would agree. Like, I've talked to all my neighbors. They all know, of course, I'm a pastor. And but again, the thing I always hear from them is, yeah, I've been meaning to go to church.
To go back.
Yeah, got out of the habit, and life's busy, and so I just want to keep giving them the opportunity.
Yeah, whenever you get the chance, I think, just step out in faith, and that, plant that seed. You've asked the question, you've opened the door, kind of like put the ball in their court, and God's going to use that for them to mull around a little bit in their mind. The Holy Spirit's going to get his foothold in there, and that's all you can pray for, And that's great. The Wife for Harvest, And you talked about Serbia, the opportunities there. I mean, in Ukraine now, in Hungary.
George Markey used to tell me, and this was prior to the war right now, but George Markey in Ukraine always used to tell me, the only thing stopping us from planting as many churches as we wanted is we just don't have enough people. We don't have enough leaders. It isn't that the people in the city are not interested or responsive. It's just they don't have enough leaders to lead them. And I always thought, man, I mean, that's what Jesus is talking about. But I think that that's not just true in Ukraine. And what's interesting in Ukraine, it's actually maybe even more needed now than it was before, because now you have all these people who've moved around, people who were in churches, now they're in new cities, and there's not enough churches to serve the people who've shown up, et cetera. So, I mean, the whole landscape has changed, but there's a lot of opportunity. I mean, the same thing's true here. I think the same thing's true around this region as well, that I'm involved with the ministry that's helping train church planters. And we have more requests than we have people that we can send.
And that was the way it was early days of Calvary Chapel there in Hungary. It's, hey, can you come to our city? Can you come to our city? And, some people have to wait a couple of years for, somebody to show up and come and start something. And when it did, it grew, and God used it. So, it's something to pray for. The next generation we're sending out this summer. I know that a lot of those young people are going to get on fire. Eyes are going to be opened when they go across, the big pond and to Hungary, and they experience kind of being out of their comfort zone and sharing their faith and their life with people that want to hear. And it's going to be exciting to hear their stories when they come back. And so we wanted to just look at another word. When we were studying this and discussing this passage, when we got there in verse 36, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And there's so many things in that particular verse. One, that word harassed really stuck out to me. Like it has a lot of connotations. And when you think of the Pharisees as the ones that were considered the shepherds of Israel, Jesus is making, quite accusations here, and really speaking to the care of the the children of Israel under those people that were supposed to be caring for them. And I just want to look at that word harassed again. I know we talked a little bit about it on Sunday, but when you read through these verses, sometimes skip over it. But I think that for me, that word really just sticks out.
Yeah, I mean, helpless. Let's start with that. Sheep by nature are helpless animals. They can't feed themselves. They can't protect themselves. They have no natural defense. They're not even good at running away. And this, again, from Ezekiel 34, this is like almost a direct reference to that, because Ezekiel 34, God speaks against the bad shepherds of Israel, meaning the religious leaders of that time who would neglect the people. He says, I see my people, they're like sheep scattered on the hills, and they're left to the wolves, and they're just going to be devoured by the wolves. And so that all that language is brought up by Jesus in different places where he talks about, the good shepherd who comes, and the good shepherd's different than the bad shepherds of Israel. He says, I am the good shepherd. Because there in Ezekiel 34, what God says then is he says, I will come and shepherd my flock. If you guys are going to not do what you're supposed to do, then I'll do it myself. And essentially that's who Jesus is. That's why he says, I am the good shepherd. And the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He's not just a hireling. And then he says, and I have more sheep I want to bring in. So it's not just those who are ethnically descended from Abraham, but those who will believe in God as Abraham did. They will also become part of the flock. And so that's an important piece of this as well. But harassed, it means to be troubled, distressed. I talked about it's like being rubbed raw by life, dragged over the coals. It's just somebody who's been beat down by life. And I think that's something that all of us can relate to. And I mean, that's how Jesus saw these people. It wasn't, they're lost. Nobody's teaching them. They're neglected. And what happens if you're a neglected sheep? You get eaten by the wolves. We talk about that metaphor that comes in, right? There are these ravenous wolves who will come in. Paul says this in Acts 20 when he's talking to the Ephesian elders. After I leave here, wolves are going to come in amongst your midst, and they're going to seek to deceive people with false doctrines and false teachings and take advantage of them. In other words, a wolf is somebody who's not a sheep, and they take advantage of sheep to fatten themselves up. And this exists even today, right? There are people who take advantage of the childlike faith of the people of God. And so they need shepherds who will be able to protect the people, be able to lead the people, be able to feed the people. And this is a very important metaphor.
Yeah, and one of the reasons it stuck out to me was just in the in the context of the entire scripture. When you think about the harvest and you think about the people that we're encountering out there, or the people that walk through our doors on a Sunday morning, many times they are harassed and helpless. They've been told lies by Satan. They've been beat on by the world. They've been told who they're supposed to be or what they're not supposed to be, and they've been pulled this way and that way. And these are the kind of people that we are, encountering when you're going out into the harvest. These is the type, this is the condition that many times you can find people in, and they're just helpless, and they're like, many times religion is like it's the last straw, it's like, or it's like what you say, the last thing they turn to. They've tried everything else, and finally they've come to the end of themselves, and they're helpless. They've been harassed through their lives, and they're feeling beat down, as you said, raked over the coals, and they walk through the door, and and we want to greet them as Jesus would have greeted them, and with love, grace, welcoming them in, as we've seen every one of these people that got healed. The woman that was the issue of blood touched, how did he react to her? Someone been, harassed, beat down for 12 years of her life, and he turns to her and he heals her. Or to even the centurion that met him, he didn't harass him, or, like, what are you doing beating up my Jewish brothers? He's like, man, this guy's got faith. So it's like we can learn so much by Jesus' interactions of these last couple of chapters, because the people that we're going to be encountering have been harassed and helpless, So, but yeah, no, great. And so, just kind of as we end this podcast, we want to kind of look at, as you said on Sunday, we're leaving chapters 8 and 9, we're moving to chapter 10. And maybe just kind of, let's jump back out again and kind of like just give a review of kind of the sections of Matthew and where we're heading, kind of give us a preview of what's happening.
Yeah, so like really from the end of chapter 4 until the end of chapter 9, you have one big section. It's all about Jesus' authority. That authority is shown in his teaching and then in his actions of miracles. And that tells us about the early days of Jesus' ministry. And one of the ways that Matthew's organized is that there are 5 teaching blocks. And you know that you've come to an end of a teaching block because it'll say, when Jesus finished saying these things, then did this. So you have these like teaching blocks and then action blocks. So at the end of chapter 7, it says, when Jesus finished saying these things, then he did these things. And then we're going to see that in chapter 10 now that we're entering into is it's the second of 5 teaching blocks. And some people have noticed that there's a corollary there between like the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and that Jesus is the prophet who was promised, who would be like Moses but greater than him. That's from Deuteronomy chapter 18. And so they say, okay, so Jesus is the new Moses with these 5 teaching blocks that Matthew lays out. And I think that that's intentional.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
As Matthew was primarily for the Israelites.
Yeah.
That was his primary audience.
Right. So he's showing Jesus as a rabbi. He's showing Jesus as the prophet. And so that's really important. So, you could look at the first 3.5 chapters of Matthew as being like kind of like laying the foundation for who Jesus is, kind of the backstory of Jesus. Chapters 4.5 through 9 are looking at Jesus' early ministry and his authority. And then moving on from chapter 10, we're looking at kind of the middle of Jesus' ministry, some of the things that he taught. Chapter 10 specifically teaching on mission. And then we're going to get into what happened after that, some more miracles he performed, then another block of teaching, getting into his parables, and we'll go from there.
All right, I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, no, it's been great so far as we've got through, especially these last couple of chapters, just looking at the healing that Jesus taking place. We took time in church to lean into that, to pray for people and to pray for relationships, pray for our city, pray for our country, that the God would just bring healing. So if you missed any of that, you definitely want to get there. You want to get caught up before we dive into chapter 10 and whitefieldschurch.com. Get over there. You can download, share this with somebody who might want to know how we got our name and, share that piece of history. And we look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.